So I was at the grocery store today, and I'm stoked, folks. Fucking stoked. I finally ran across some. It's finally available in my area. Stubbs. Original legendary barbecue sauce. Yep. Never tried it. I'll fire up the grill this weekend and see what's up with it. Do some pork chops, some chicken, some steak, some burgers, some hot dogs. Yeah, we'll see what's up with it. But, it's got to be good. It has to be. There's an old black guy on the label. Part 6.
Murders were inspired by secret messages that he supposedly contrived from listening to the White Album, right?
Right, the Helter Skelter reference.
Well, you have to keep in mind why that's this whole idea that he was a starstruck nobody who only wished he could communicate with the Beatles. Dennis Wilson and all of the Beach Boys, who Manson got to know fairly well, and so did many of his other associates, including the girls, they knew the Beatles very well. So, he was moving in circles with people who knew the Beatles quite well. And he never was a great admirer of the Beatles. The young people around him were, but he wasn't. But the fact is, if he wanted to talk to the Beatles, Paul McCartney had visited Brian Wilson, who Manson knew, in that period. And in a recording studio in Brian Wilson's home, where Manson actually recorded the demo for another album, Paul McCartney had been there. So he was only ever one phone call away from the Beatles, and he knew many people who were befriended with him. So I think that's an important point to make clear. Now, the significance of Dennis Wilson is often overshadowed. It's sort of treated like a novelty, that this wholesome and good-natured and most cheerful of the major rock bands of the 60s would have been involved in the supposedly sinister Manson family. But the fact is, Dennis Wilson was deeply searching for a spiritual mentor. He had recently gone with the Beatles to India to meet the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, along with Mia Farrow and many other Hollywood and music industry figures. And the whole Wilson family were looking for spiritual answers. So there was really nothing strange about Dennis Wilson being intrigued with Manson's philosophy and spiritual practices. And what needs to be understood is Wilson has been treated like he was used and abused by Manson. Yeah, so the myth, which I sort of have to keep reminding people, what is the cover story is that Manson, this con man and manipulator, swooped in on Dennis Wilson and, like some sort of vampire, parasitically abused him and exploited him. But actually, the opposite is true. Dennis Wilson was looking for someone to give him a cultural spark or inspiration at a time when he was sort of lost. And he recorded one of Manson's songs, and he was greatly impressed with Manson's music. And he recorded with the Beach Boys a song called Cease to Exist, which he changed the name of the song to Never Learn Not to Love. And you can hear that on the 2020 album of the Beach Boys. Well, rather than Manson using Wilson, what happened is that Wilson put this song out on an album without crediting Manson as the songwriter, took credit for him himself, never paid him except for giving him a motorcycle, and Manson never signed a contract because he's quite naive as to the ways of the outside world. He assumed, according to the underworld code, that a man's word is his honor. And a lot of the bad blood that came later came from this, which is not understood. It isn't that Manson never made it in the music industry. It's that he did, and he wasn't compensated. He was not paid, and Dennis Wilson changed the lyrics to his song, never gave him credit for the song, and basically took it as his own, which I think anyone would be resentful about. So that's a little different than how most people interpret the story. Another important factor, which I'm extending in the new forthcoming edition of the Manson File, a lot more getting into the musical history, because I think that's not sufficiently understood. Not only was Manson sufficiently admired by the movers and shakers and influencers of the Hollywood music industry, but he was given two opportunities to record a major album. One was at Brian Wilson's home studio at Bellagio Road that was recorded by Steve Desper, who was the Beach Boys recording engineer. And another was recorded with the Wrecking Crew, which is one of, I don't know if you're familiar with their legend, but they were basically a crack group of session musicians, the finest session musicians in Los Angeles. And basically they recorded all of the music for many of the hit songs of the 60s, from Sonny and Cher, Phil Spector, The Byrds, countless others. You name a hit song from that time. The open secret in the music industry was this group that was colloquially known as the Wrecking Crew. These session people recorded the real music, and that went out on the records to make the band sound better, because they were excellent musicians, sometimes superior to bands. Well, when you consider one of the best session groups in the world at that time were hired by Terry Melcher to record an album with Manson. That's never been publicly revealed. Nobody knows about that. Similarly, the album that Dennis Wilson sponsored, that was going to be released on the Beach Boys label, has also disappeared from the face of the earth. So both of those record projects would have shown Manson in a very different light. But I could go further with all of his connections, which I do in the book, but to sum it up, this was not an unsuccessful, desperate striver trying to get into the music industry. This is somebody that people like Terry Melcher, one of the main rock producers of the time, Neil Young, and many others admired, respected, and were actively trying to promote, as what Carol Kay, who was one of the members of the Wrecking Crew, said that when she met Brian Wilson once at Capitol Records, he introduced her to Manson, who she didn't know at the time, nobody did, and said, he's going to be the next big thing in the 70s. So that just to give you an idea of how wrong the myth, the public myth of what you think about Manson's connection to the rock world is.
Well, the Beach Boys myth is a pertinent one, and I think I recall a Beach Boys biopic in the 1990s where the character of Charles Manson, though only appearing briefly, he was sort of treated as a hanger-on to the Beach Boys.
Right, that was a really incompetent TV movie in the 90s, and I can remember the scene. He's presented as some kind of horrific horror film stereotype, and they are immediately frightened of him. But that wasn't the case at all. And in the book, in which I can lay this all out in much clearer context, because it's really complicated to counter the myth that people have with the more banal facts. They liked him, most of them liked him. Dennis Wilson admired him and really thought he was a genius. And unfortunately for the Beach Boys myth, Wilson spoke to at least two major rock magazines in 1968 and is ranting and raving about how great this new musician Charles Manson is and how they're going to put his record out. So there's a lot of evidence that's seeped into the public, but you'd have to dig for it. Most people believe, as you said, that of course our beloved rock idols immediately recognized he was dangerous and wanted to get away from it. That wasn't the case at all. Now, another odd thing I just wanted to mention in passing, in the recent research that I'm adding to the update of the Manson File, I had discovered something I'd heard rumors about, but many people who I spoke to who knew Dennis Wilson after the murders said that they believed he knew immediately when the Tate LaBianca murders occurred that Manson was involved with it, and that he became just a nervous